I had gotten very confused between spaciousness and spacing out. And so I went to the retreat into Rinpoche, and it was for the residents of Genpo Abbey, about 30 people there. And for 5 days, all he did was say, "Where is your mind?" That was it. And where is your mind? Where is it now? Where is your mind? He might have said, might have changed it up a little bit, but basically that was it. And for somebody who was so confused about, spacing out, this was like manna from heaven for me. It was just exactly what I needed.
Hey everyone, it's Raghu back with Mindrolling, and I am so super happy to be speaking to Helen Tworkov today. And I have known of Helen for a long time because of our mutual friend, Mirabai Bush. Never mind that. Tricycle, let's try that too. And, my relation with many different Buddhist teachers. We have so many things, Helen. Welcome first. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
We have so many intersections. It's amazing. All the way to, you have this little chapter in the book. I just, going through it and I go, Montreal? He was in Montreal in May of 1970, and I was there as well. It's just before I went to India, when Ram Dass went back that second time. I'm Canadian, and that's where I'm from, Montreal. So that was that was another intersection. But we can't possibly, so Helen has a book, Lotus Girl, which is basically a memoir. But within it are so many different, shall we say, themes that can be very helpful in a person's life. And my big thing with Mindrolling is all about how can we share more about to get more balance in our lives. And there's so much of this there. But it's also, you've had a rather entertaining life as well. and on top of it all, Helen, I was like, I could have been in your family or you could have been in mine, okay? So I really appreciate it.
We were, actually. I think we were. Just maybe not in time, but pretty close.
Yeah, right. But just tell us, can you give us a little bit of, because it would be great for people to have some understanding of how it was when you grew up, and you grew up in a household, and there was, and the trauma that was passed down by what happened in Europe in the Second World War was very much evident there. And tell us how you came up and what you were dealing with your parents and with the world around you in New York.
It's a broad question.
Yeah.
I did not grow up in a Jewish community. I grew up in a Catholic neighborhood. So my identity of being Jewish was always very much as an outsider, as part of many different outsider elements in my life. So I didn't really have, I didn't even associate the tremendous amount of depression or sadness in my life with the Holocaust until much later. We had enough of family members that had died in the camps, distant relatives. Nothing about it felt very immediate. And I didn't really try to put it together until much later when I tried to sort of come to grips with suffering and the nature of suffering. That's when I began to try to make some coherence out of all of this.
But, I guess I really related because in terms of the kind of father, I had a very tyrannical father as well, who was a World War II bomber pilot and had major PTSD and didn't have any way to grasp even that concept. He was just angry, despotic, and so on. And my mother went through her trauma, and so she was someone who lived with, incredibly deep depression. So there's a way where I could really relate. I'll just, my listeners know this story quite well, but you don't, so I thought I'd share it with you in relation to family upbringing. So I had this difficult time all through teenagerhood and so on. And there's one other thing I want to talk to you about, because jazz was a big deal for me then. And I actually, first out-of-body experience as a teenager was being in a club with John Coltrane in Montreal. I don't know how I got in, but that's a whole other story. But so we went through this, and it was a constant war with my father. This was the theme all through my teenage years. And at some point, of course, I went to India, and back when Ram Dass went back the second time, and met Neem Karoli Baba, who we called Maharaji. And at some point, my father actually came over to India. I mean, this is 50s, maybe in his 50s, business ad agency guy. He was archetypical in that world, and I thought, what in the world is he? I was writing to him and saying, this is an incredible experience, and boy, oh boy. But he actually came. And he sat down, and Neem Karoli Baba at one point looked, after telling him exactly how he had come, you flew over, you stopped in Germany, and the Indian businessman got, stuff that nobody could know about, all that, just to break his mind up a little bit, and all of ours. And he looked at me and he said, did you give him the medicine? I said, yeah, he had a cold. I gave him some aspirin. Yeah, he's okay now. He said, nay, yogi medicine Ram Dass gave me. This is in Hindi, right? I went, acid? My father? And my father went, LSD? So he said, take care of your father while he's in India. And do you believe, of course, one person, and we went down to the burning ghats in Benares. We were living in a houseboat right there, right by them. You've been there, I know. And I found a tab. Somebody gave me a tab of acid. He took it. And that was the beginning of a complete change that saved my family. My entire family ended up in India with Maharaji. My mother with Siddhima, who later on was this incredible saint there as well. And that moment was, I don't know, I mean, if we could have gone, those people in Madras that you go to them and they have these people or whatever leaves that they read your whole life out front. Deepak Chopra talked about it. He said, yeah, no, it's real. Anyhow, if that would have been, that had to be in the leaves for sure. This was not a random event by any stretch. So in my case, thanks to that which is, we were saved as a family. I mean, we completely came together under really inauspicious circumstances. And the same thing, it seems to me, happened to you in a much, much different way, obviously through Buddhism. Tell us about that. I guess that's your entry point.
Well, we didn't come together in any of the ways you're talking about.
No, huh? But you were able to have some equanimity over the reality of how you came into this world and the karma of it.
Yeah, I wouldn't have called it as the family coming together. I certainly changed up my own perception.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's big in and of its own, right? So just tell us a little bit of how you actually got to the East. I think that's, something everybody would be interested in. And, just what are the fulcrums that led you to even consider and open yourself up to Buddhism?
The two most important factors that led to Asia, the first trip was in 1965, The first is the story that opens the book, is seeing the photograph of Thich Quang Duc. That's the Vietnamese monk who set himself on fire in 1963 in protest of his own government's crackdown on Buddhist clergy. Everyone our age, as you must know surely, remembers that photograph. And it was an amazing image, because you had first of all, you had a monk in monk's clothing, sitting in full meditation posture. But the most important thing is that here was a human being on fire who is sitting with it. He was not flinching. He was not rolling to get away from the flames. He was surrounded by his own community of monks and nuns. They were chanting. There were police there who did not try to stop him or hose him down. The whole thing unfolded with this extraordinary degree of equanimity within these flames. And it was that combination of the equanimity and the flames that was, I found, totally captivating. And because of political events in Saigon, called Saigon at that time, because of political events, there were a lot of Western journalists there present. And they certainly wrote about it. It was on the front page of every newspaper in the world the next day. But they did not know how to describe his mind. So they kind of circumvented that part. They talked about the politics, but they had no way of describing a mind that was capable of holding that much pain, if it was even pain. We don't know. It was so incomprehensible. And so that was a big, big, big hook for me, seeing that photograph and wondering what kind of mind could be sitting with a body that's burning up. And then actually, this is a kind of a curious thing. About 6 months before that, I had started taking LSD with through Leary and then Alpert, who became Ram Dass. And this was when they were just before they were fired from Harvard. So they were still in Newton, near Cambridge. And I actually never put the experience of LSD together with how I perceived Quang Duc's mind. That came about many, many, many years later through a question that a friend of mine asked. Did taking acid make you more sensitive to some aspect of Quang Duc's mind? And only at that point did I have to say, yeah, I think so. But I had never understood it with that much consequence. That something about taking the acid and having a very, very different experience of mind than the one that I was used to having could actually have created a curiosity about Quang Duc that I might not have had otherwise. So I would say that between the psychedelics and my very first experience of a Buddhist monk sitting in flames, that oriented me to Asia, and I left in 1965.
65. Wow.
Yeah.
How you were just beyond a teenager then, something like that, right?
I was a baby.
Yeah. I was old. I was 23 when I went to India. Wait, you're leaving something out that to me was like crucial, because I had a similar experience, and it's that experience you had on the Cape, right, when you were 15. Disappearing. Tell that experience.
When I was 15 years old, I was walking, or 16, I can't remember. Anyway, I was with 3 or 4 friends, and we were walking on the dunes in Truro, the Bayside in Truro, Cape Cod, and I completely disappeared. Everything around me was familiar. I knew where I was. I had some sense of sea and ocean and friends, but there was, I think the way I describe it in the book is that, let's say if I was looking at a tree 50 feet away, there'd be like a string between me and the string, like there was some kind of connection between my eye and that object, or my ears and that sound over there. And so this was like an experience, and this was long before acid, not so dissimilar to
right, I was going to say.
but long before that. And so it was as I could hear the sound, but it had nothing to do with my own ears. Or I could see the ocean, but it had nothing to do with my own eyes. And everything was extremely bright and very vivid. And then about 4 minutes later, I came back into my body. And I think in the book, I talk about how I was, I didn't say anything because I thought I was crazy. And I also discovered as an adult meditator that quite a few people have had that experience. And they had a similar experience to me. They didn't talk about it because they thought it was a little nuts. And because I had a long history of mental illness in my family, it didn't take much for me to question my own sanity. Oh. And it wasn't until I became a meditator that I had have any, not only some way of comprehending what happened, but also some way of comprehending the benefit of it. Because I think there was, at the time, I had no understanding that kind of break with reality could be an entry into a deeper reality that was very true. I didn't know that. It was certainly another reality, but I didn't know whether it was a sane reality or an insane reality.
Out of sane reality. That's probably it. And so the same thing happened to me when I was 17. And I briefly mentioned it. I went out at a John Coltrane concert in a club. I don't know how they got me even in because you had to be 18 or 21. I don't even know. And he played my favorite things. It's indelible. It's as indelible as the first minute I met Neem Karoli Baba in me, and it just gone. All I remember at the end was noticing that Elvin Jones, who played drums for Coltrane, he had a cigarette in his mouth. He never touched it, and he was playing the whole time, and he was extraordinary. It burned all the way down to the filter in his mouth, and I remember I came back in on that. Oh my God, does he know what he's doing? Anyhow, that was interestingly enough. The other day or a week ago, I was on a panel called "Music and Psychedelics." So the experience that you just described, that's described in the book as well, is, as you just said, there's nothing different about it than a psychedelics experience. The possibility of it, for sure. And these people were talking about how psychedelics enhance what happens to you when music absorbs you and takes you. And I said, well, I had the experience the opposite. It was the music that absorbed me and took me. And later I identified it because I had not taken acid. I had not used it at that time. And years later, as you say, yes, it was all validated, the truth. In your case, you're talking about meditation, which is absolutely no different. So, yeah. Yeah, it's, and by the way, I just wanted to bring up one thing in terms of when I say there's so much in this book that really incite your being into a place where you get a feeling of what we're talking about with the spiritual journey, and one of them is, you were a big seeker of truth, and you were trying to get truth out of, in a worldly way around your family and what had happened to members of your family and so on. And I hear you say in the book, but the seeking the truth about my family, or the power of the mind to manipulate direct experience, was not disconnected from the investigations that took shape later. Can you talk about that a little bit, Helen?
Well, if I hadn't become a meditator or a seeker, I could have spent a long, long, long time in psychoanalysis trying to unpack. There's this big secret in my family around my mother's mother. I had grown up being told that she was dead. Turned out that she was not dead. It turned out that she lived in an insane asylum in something called Manhattan State. It was a institution. My family had no money. And not only was she alive, my mother actually visited her almost every week. And this huge secret strategy, these, big strategizing going on, how to get my mother out of the house. We were at it, we would leave first and then she would go and then she'd be back. It was just, it was a big family secret, and it involved a lot of lies. And I did, I was like a little, what do you call it? Hound dog. I knew something was up, but I didn't know what it was. But boy, I was determined to find out. And I knew there was something going on. And I knew that there was some big secret around my mother's mother. It never occurred to me that she had been alive. That was the biggest shock. I knew there was a mystery around her. And so if I hadn't become a seeker, a spiritual seeker, that might have just remained as a big psychological conundrum. And how did that affect me? And that trauma, and how hurt I was by it. And I could blame both my parents, and I could go down that whole rabbit hole. But when I began, it's a curious thing. For a long time in my own studies in Buddhism, I kept thinking, I don't want to learn how to be kind. I don't want to learn about compassion. I want to learn about reality. And that had something to do with my background. And it took me a long time to understand, what a happy coincidence. It turns out that Buddhism is reality. And that's what all they're ever trying to teach you. And I didn't quite get that. So it was like, oh, this is really amazing that all these teachings on compassion and wisdom and kindness, there is no separation between that.
They are reality, yeah.
But when I started off, I think I was, at the beginning, I was kind of oriented around this quest for reality that came out of my trying to understand my family.
That's what I mean. I had this dramatic thing with my father, but the universe worked its way through you in the way that it needed to, for you to get to the same place, as far as I'm concerned. So, by the way, here again, speaking to, I kind of found a few spots where I went, yeah, that's something we should really share, and this is it. Confirming that the mind could transform what felt good one moment into something horrifying the next moment, even when the sensation itself remained the same. Intriguing, but just a game. It would take immersion in meditation decades later, which is what you've been talking about, before I fully explored the power of preconception. So everybody who's listening or watching, this is, in my mind, just a gigantic awareness, mindfulness around this. Please, Helen, just speak to it a little bit.
Well, in the book, it's a game that I started playing when I was about 5 years old, that I would, at night, I would tickle my own hand. So I would run my fingers over one hand, and it would be a very, very pleasant sensation. And then I would imagine that if I turned the light on, and I saw that it was a cockroach, that I would scream. I would be horrified. I grew up on East 23rd Street.
There are plenty of them. Yeah.
Regularly infested by cockroaches. So the possibility of a cockroach crawling across my hand wasn't so far-fetched. But I became very intrigued with this idea, that the sensation was the same. And I could have a very negative response or a positive response based on my preconception of what was going on. And then I developed a big game out of it. So I played it a lot. But of course, and then at some point I stopped playing it, like we stopped playing our childhood games. And I didn't even, until I became a meditator, I didn't really work with it as something that had to be investigated over and over and over and over and over again to try to really catch the mind as it continued its tenacious its tenacious attraction to preconception. Catch it, and to try to actually look at something as it is, without all the memory, without the preconception, without all the ideas and the judgment and the biases. So that was
Yeah. That is something for all of us. Okay, I'm going to jump to fun stuff like hanging out at Millbrook with Leary and Alpert, and all the incredible people who came by. And I mean, yeah, what was that like? What was that scene like? I mean, we used to, in India once, we went up and it was just Ram Dass, myself, and Krishnadas, who I think you know as well, and a few others in a house overlooking the Himalayas that were like 75 miles as a crow flies. And he would regale us with these stories and so on. And we were like, wow, the level at which the experimenting with psychedelic drugs was extraordinary. And you were right in it. So you got to give us a little taste.
I wasn't actually right in it. I was very much on the periphery. I was a very young woman. I had no status in that community. It was a very status-oriented community. Sure, there were a lot of famous people who came in, and the people who were there and were very conscious and aware of the status of people coming into the community, whether it was an academic status or art status or musician status, whatever it was. And in retrospect, I honestly don't have the fondest memories of it.
Really?
No, I don't. I see it as extremely male-oriented, as everything was in those days. There'd be no reason for it to be any different. Sort of like our spiritual communities, we would like them to be much more progressive than the rest of the society in areas where they tend not to be. They tend to be often than not echoes. And certainly Millbrook, this was in the 60s? And it was very male-oriented. And I actually never trusted the LSD gurus. I found it. I found a lot of what today we would call white privilege. It felt like that was extremely predominant. Very kind of taking it, kind of playing it being bad because they knew they could get away with it, and of course they did. They were Harvard, but they were still the Harvard professors. That a lot of leeway. They weren't going to go to jail for this or that, or things that other people might go to jail for. And so there was a lot of entitlement, I would say. Yeah.
Wow.
I know that's a different view than many people
to say the very
have, but I think I got into that more in the book and then took it out because it kind of wasn't what the book was about. And I certainly have a great debt to them and a great debt to what they did and what they brought to the culture and the changes that they helped create in the culture. But it's a mixed scene for me.
I mean, I've heard stuff from Bob Thurman's wife, Nana, that was a little bit different than the story that's, publicly available, as well as Peggy Hitchcock. I'm sure you knew Peggy as well, who I loved and who just passed. But you met one person there. Out of all of this, I was more interested in that one person than anyone else.
I know.
Charlie Mingus. Okay. I mean, I couldn't believe it. And you went out to, so you were a young woman, you say without status, whatever the hell that meant. He liked you, and he took you to lunch in the village or something, right?
I don't know. The big thing with Mingus, and I talk about this in the book, I met him at Newton. This was at the old house before Millbrook. And what I describe in the book, I mean, he was already incredibly famous at that point. I can't remember what year it was, but he was very uncomfortable. He always had, I think, quite a lot of paranoia going on. And he was sort of sitting there in the kitchen. We were both sitting at the kitchen table. And he was feeling, he communicated that he decisively did not feel that he belonged there. I certainly didn't feel that I belonged there. I was just trying to wing it, pretend to be cool and pretend to be hip and pretend to be on the inside crowd. I didn't know anything. I was 20 years old. I didn't know anything. And I knew who he was, but he was really uncomfortable. and very sort of looking around in a very kind of wary way, the way he could. And then we came back to the city together, and I don't remember whether we drove. And maybe he had a car. We drove back, and I was staying at my parents' apartment on 23rd Street between 2nd and 3rd. It's right off the Bowery, and he had a loft a few blocks north on the Bowery. And so then he invited me to lunch. But the biggest thing about this lunch is that it took place at a bar called Connolly's. That bar was on the corner of my own block. I had passed that bar. It was a bar restaurant. I had passed that place. It had to be 10,000 times in my life. Every time I left my building, I would pass that restaurant and bar. I'd never gone inside. It was an Irish bar restaurant, and it was under, in those years, there was something called the 3rd Avenue L, the elevated trains that went above the avenue. Yeah. Everything below was dark and dank, and from 23rd Street south is where the flop houses and the street bums lived. It was not so pretty. And this place was, I don't know who went there, but it had these sort of starched white tablecloths and white napkins and little lace curtains. For some reason, Charlie loved this restaurant. And he used to invite me and his son, who was about my age, Charles Jr., for these Sunday lunches. And it was just the combination of being with Charlie and his son in this place that I had passed I could have been flown to New Guinea. I wasn't out. So it was like this diet, something so exotic and so outside my whatever I knew about, that it was that had a huge impression. And of course, what it led to is that he invited me and my sister and her husband for her birthday to the 5 Spot, and Thelonious Monk was playing. And but I already knew about the 5 Spot and had been there, and I knew the Termini brothers who ran it because my father was a painter, and he hung out at the 5 Spot where the artists whose studios on the Bowery hung out. And then I went back a few weeks later, or I can't remember, and I got a job at being the hot check crew.
It's so great. By the way, we have to say, for those of you who might not know who Charlie Mingus is, because you're not a jazz fan, he was one of the preeminent artists in jazz. I mean, along the lines of Charlie Parker, Bird, and so many more, Coltrane and so on, and a composer so unique. Nobody was like him. And guess what? I was in the 5 Spot and I saw him there. Again, I don't think I was more than 17. I was going to boarding school in Connecticut, and I would take the train in because I loved him so much. And it was Danny Richmond used to play drums for him, and he was for Mingus. And he was very uptight about white people, and it was sort of a threatening atmosphere. There wasn't a lot of us in the room at that time. Anyhow, Mingus, I mean, that's like saying, and I know meeting one of the great, His Holiness, which we have to talk about him as well, but that's how great I felt about that you had this time with Charlie Mingus. I could never have thought of that when I started reading this book, Hal. So great. So great. Well, you got to tell us about this would be like a 5-6 hour podcast to go through many of the moments, but certainly His Holiness is an important being in your life. So just tell us how you met him and what he is to you, and in terms of your entry point and depth that you have gone into Tibetan Buddhism.
Well, I certainly became extremely aware of him my first visit to Nepal, when I did volunteer work at Tibetan refugee camps, because this was 1965 and 65, 66. And so, the situation with the Tibetans coming out was still extremely raw, and they were coming into Kathmandu and into the camp that I volunteered at was in outside of Pokhara. And so their veneration of this man was certainly at the forefront of their lives. And that was their devotion and what they meant to him. And then the whole kind of introduction to Tibetan Buddhism happened around that time. I can't remember. I actually was in the room with him several times over the years. So I really can't remember all the different times. I certainly went to teachings of his at different times. But when I started Tricycle in 1991, we had a photograph of His Holiness on the cover. And for the inaugural issue, I asked Spalding Gray to interview His Holiness. And again, for your listeners who don't know who Spalding Gray was, he died quite a few years ago now. He was a monologuist.
The greatest monologuist.
Yeah. I know you talk more about him. I don't know how to describe him. You say something.
No, he's a very idiosyncratic character. But yeah, go ahead. He was that for sure.
I arranged for him to do this interview, and it took place at Fess Parker's. Wait a second, Fess Parker's Red Lion Inn, something like that.
In Santa Barbara. Yeah.
And so I went out for that interview, and so I was in the room with him and Spalding. And what was really interesting about Spalding, being Spalding, asked questions that nobody else would have asked him. By that time, His Holiness was very well known, and he had won the Nobel Peace Prize a few years earlier. So his photograph was all over the place, and there were many, many interviews, and the interviews were fairly scripted. And people started following the same formula. And so they were asking the same questions. Well, so Spalding gets into this room with him and he asks him things like, what does it feel like when you look out the window and you're looking down in the swimming pool and there are all these gorgeous teenage girls running around in bikinis? And he asked him about death and dying, and he asked him about flying in Tibet, and he asked him all these questions, which I have to say, some of the early readers of Tricycle were horrified by. But what I saw is that His Holiness was completely delighted, and that's what mattered to me. Is I didn't. Spalding was definitely not offending him at all. He just thought it was wonderful to be engaged with these questions that he had never been asked before. So there was always something about his manner of being so relaxed and so accommodating and so willing to be open to whatever arose in front of him. That was extraordinary to be around.
Yeah, he is extraordinary. There's something in the book. I don't, maybe you can recount it. If not, I'm happy to read it. I have it in front of me. But it's a story about His Holiness. And the elderly monk who requests his permission.
Oh, yeah.
Can you want to tell?
Yeah.
It's a great story.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary story. It's an elderly monk comes to see His Holiness to ask for the transmission for a particular kind of practice, particular kind of Tibetan Buddhism or Vajrayana practice that involves a certain amount of physical movements. And His Holiness says to him, you're really too old for this kind of practice. I'm gonna suggest that I give you another practice that be more in sync with your capacities at this time in your life. And so he gives him this other practice, and the monk goes off. And then His Holiness learns, this is all from this is an interview that comes from a French journalist. Monk goes off, and a while later, His Holiness learns that the monk commits suicide. And he commits suicide because he wants to be reborn fast so he can do the more robust practice.
Yeah.
And what the journalist says is, how did you get over that? And what's the amazing part of the story is that His Holiness is completely astonished by the question. The guy says, how did you get over that? And His Holiness just says, like completely dumbfounded. And then he says, "You don't get over something like that."
Yeah.
And so we don't know exactly what that means, but my interpretation, you don't get over like the remorse or the regret or whatever that is. But obviously His Holiness is not somebody who's living with remorse and regret. And so what I heard, which was critically important to me to learn, is that you actually could hold a kind of sadness or remorse or whatever you want to call it, regret, but it doesn't define you. And I didn't, when I first heard this story, when I was first working in the Tibetan camps, I did not know that you could hold suffering and sorrow and happiness and joy at the same time. I didn't grow up knowing that. And this was part of the
Neither did I.
This is part of
we
a
did
whole
not. Yeah.
background. And so that's something that I learned from the Tibetans. And so this story, and I think I tell it as it didn't happen at the camp when I was working there, but I tell it in relationship to working at the camp, because it was somehow what I learned at the camp was this capacity for holding trauma, grief, regret, and not being defined by it, not being consumed by it, not being fixated on it and fixed by it.
Yeah, which is an extraordinary lesson. Actually, Ram Dass talked about it too in a different way. He said, as we humans have the capacity to live on more than one plane of consciousness at the same time. And I think this spells that out. Oh my God, there's so many incredible lamas that you met, and one that I never met, and I dearly feel connected. I feel connected to him, and dearly miss that fact that I never was able to have darshan. Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. Just I've talked about him in the past, and on the podcast in many different ways. But just give us a little picture of who that being was. He's 6'8" tall Tibetan man. Okay.
Well, by the time I knew him, he was already elderly, or at least I was so young, but I was at that age when it didn't take somebody being all that old for me to perceive them as being very, very old. I don't really remember how old he would have been then, but he, it's hard not to talk about his height, because his height would be anomalous in New York City, but among Tibetans, it was completely extraordinary. He had, more than a foot taller than most of the people, his monks.
Right.
And by the time I met him and knew him, he was walking he would rest his elbows on the shoulders of two of his tallest monks. And that's how he'd be walking. And he often had his chest would often be exposed. He'd be wearing like just a kind of a lower robe. And he had his white hair, thinning hair pulled back into a little bun.
Yeah.
So, and I first met him, he was in America. So to see this figure in the United States was just, it's like an apparition. It was like, it was other than anything we could be looking. Right. And it's he had this kind of, he had, everything about him was big. His physicality was big, his radiance was big, his heart was big, his generosity was big. Everything that you could describe about a human being, he had more so, bigger than. It's fantastic.
Oh, my. Yeah, I believe they would say he was a real Siddha, Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. And that's great that you had that wonderful good karmas with him. And you had it with somebody else who I dearly love as well, and love the whole family, and I know you do too, is the family of Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, and particularly Mingyur Rinpoche. And I absolutely adored that book that you wrote with him, In Love with the World. By the way, I've suggested this many times, but aside from getting this fantastic book of Helen's, Lotus Girl, In Love with the World, Mingyur Rinpoche, which is the story of him escaping his monastery and becoming a sadhu in India, and he died. He had a near-death experience and came back and spent 4 years. I went off for a few months, 4 years. And how did you meet him? And I know you have a close relationship with him, but yeah.
So the first time I met him was in New York City. I was invited to a dinner party. It was not love at first sight. He was very young at that time. At that time, he must have been about 30 years old, and he was very prim. He had a very prim, very crisp quality.
Yeah.
As opposed to his older brother, who's a lay teacher.
Tsokni Rinpoche.
Tsokni Rinpoche. And even his robes appeared to be sort of more finely pressed than any other monk. Very, very, very prim and proper. That was sort of what I got from him. And but he happened to mention that in a couple of months he would be in Nova Scotia doing a retreat, leading a retreat at Gimpo Abbey. And I've had a house in Cape Breton for about, 50 years. And long before the Abbey was developed. So I took note of that. By that time I had heard, been at the Abbey many times. And I asked permission to go to that retreat. And I had gone from Tibetan Buddhism to Zen Buddhism, and then my primary Zen teacher, Maizumi Roshi, died, and I had been gotten pretty lost in my practice. And I had continued to sit, but I had gotten very confused between spaciousness and spacing out. And so I went to the retreat into Rinpoche, and it was for the residents of Gimpo Abbey, about 30 people there. And for 5 days, all he did was say, "Where is your mind?" That was it. And where is your mind? Where is it now? Where is your mind? He might have said, might have changed it up a little bit, but basically that was it. And for somebody who was so confused about, spacing out, this was like manna from heaven for me. It was just exactly what I needed. It was every question was pointing to a non-conceptual reality, but the questions themselves felt very specific and dense and very hard-hitting. And that was it. So that winter, a couple of months later, I went to a retreat that he was giving in Bodh Gaya. And I started going regularly to India. And then at that point, he started coming to America once a year too.
Is he coming back soon?
I'm taking this year off, so he's not going to be here this year, but he'll be probably next summer.
And he's in Nepal mostly, right?
In Nepal and North India.
Yeah. I was fortunate to do a couple of podcasts with him. Yeah, and after, when the book came out and so on. Yeah. Yeah, he's quite fantastic. And so is his brother. The whole family. It's ridiculous, actually. Imagine having a family like that. So anyhow, here's a little diversion that's in the book that I went, what? And it's when some of these lamas came to New York City, and you all ended up at Plato's retreat. I mean, is that real? I mean, come on. I know what that is. I remember that from the 80s, I guess. I don't know. What happened? You got to tell me.
I can't remember whose smart idea it was, because it's not mine. I knew about you have to tell who.
That's a sex club, by the way. Plato's a famous thing from the 80s. Yeah.
It was public, and it was legal, and it was public, right? Anybody could pay the door and go. And I knew about it because when it opened up, it if there was anything else like it in New York City, I don't believe it was public or legal. So this was like the first legal public club. And so it was in all the magazines. Every, New York magazine, every magazine had an article about it. So I knew about it. And there was another American woman, an American man, and 2 lamas. And it might have been the American man who's got this smart idea. But they had already, the young monks that were around Geshe Ningpo, this was in the middle 70s, they had their whole teaching careers and were ahead of them. They had lost their country. These guys were not going back to monastic situations in Tibet or teaching in Asia. And they were, they had some real curiosity about what was going on in this country and what did people do here. And we already knew that the guys in some of the American men around, this was Dutra Rinpoche Center. So the American men, we knew that they had been going to not sex clubs, but what do you call, like sex stores in Times Square?
Oh, yeah.
I've never been to one, so I don't know what goes on there, but these guys were up for anything. I mean, I did, for example, I would go to the Museum of the Metropolitan Museum of Art with them. So one minute we could be looking at Rembrandts, but the next minute we're looking at naked Greek statues. So there was like a certain kind of nudity that didn't seem particularly troubling to them, although they'd clearly not seen anything like, well, I don't know what they saw in their own country. It was like, I'm not sure. But, and so one night after the teachings, or Dharma teachings, at about 1 o'clock, 5 of us got into a taxi cab and we went to the Upper West Side to Plato's retreat. And the thing that I talk about in the book is that I was probably the most shocked person there. They weren't shocked, shocked me. I kind of like waiting for them to be utter. So there's these pools, and all these naked people are writhing together in these pools, and these body parts kept jumping up and down. And the other woman and I sat on the lounge chairs, and the 2 lamas. I think I can't remember whether we had towels around us, but the 2 lamas never took their underpants off, and they had towels wrapped around themselves. And the American man jumped into the pool. But I remember the thing that really struck me is that they didn't seem to be that fazed. It was like, ho hum, this is what Americans do, or what our new country's about. Or they didn't seem to be particularly shocked, and that shocked me.
Yeah, I bet. Unbelievable. A funny little story. Krishnadas and I, were living in New York area, and our mentors and our translators with Neem Karoli Baba, over the years came and visited us and the community. And this one man named K.C. Tiwari, who was an extraordinary accomplished yogi in the guise of a schoolmaster in a Himalayan town, who was one of the closest beings to Neem Karoli Baba and was privy to stuff nobody else was. Anyhow, he used to go, just Maharaji would look at him, he was a samadhi example. Maharaji would go, what's wrong with him? What happened to him? And he would be in samadhi and like a stone, you couldn't, it was that kind of thing. Couldn't get him to this plane of consciousness. So Krishnadas, actually, I can't remember if I was there, but he tells this story wonderfully. It was back when Times Square was Times Square, right? It was all porno and drugs and so on. And Krishnadas is walking down the street, and as he tells it, just huge billboards with buxom naked women and he's thinking, oh my God, I brought these people here. Holy God, what have I done? And he sees Mrs. Tiwari talking to Mr. Tiwari, and he says to him, what does she say? Because he's probably saying, get me out of here. And he said, well, isn't this marvelous? This is where people go to get what they want. It's a heaven world. It's great. Completely nothing to do with what our reality was, guilt and shame and, all of it. That's what I thought of when I read that part of the book. It was really great, Helen. Oh, we're kind of at the end here, and there's something at the end of the book. If you don't mind, I think I want to read it because it's just extraordinary contemplation for our times, which are so very, very difficult right now. And in times of crisis, slow down. The traditional Yoruba message proclaimed for the world today by Bayo Akomalofe, the Nigerian philosopher I've never heard of. I take solace in remembering that slowing down and staying with the discomfort will prove to be more helpful than panicking, running away, or hiding within smoky plumes of horror and fury. It also helps that the escape routes have been cut off. The leafy streets of small towns no longer provide protection, nor do the commemorative parades, the university campuses, or elementary schools, not the malls, the supermarkets, or the capitals. Sales are up for drugs, guns, and bunkers at the very same time in this world that looks bleak and getting bleaker. You are still nothing but the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. The message from the Lama, you are the world. You are the home of anonymous, spontaneous compassion that is capable of continuously arising again and again. Slow down. A great prescription for our times, Helen. Thank you for that. It's something that we're actually working on, just this kind of thing, going through, in our case, of course, with Ram Dass and this incredible decades of teachings that we have of his, of really bringing that, how do we get to that wholeness where we realize that true nature, rather than just focusing on the divide, which is so easy to do. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Everybody, Lotus Girl, Helen Tworkov, and subtitled My Life at the Crossroads of Buddhism and America. And we've only recounted a few different things with various incidents in Helen's life and people she's met, from Charlie Mingus to Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. I love that. Yeah, that's fantastic. And you go to BeHereNowNetwork.com/mindrolling. You go to the landing page there and the show notes, and there'll be links so you can get the book and just connect with, we haven't talked, that was a whole other thing. We could spend a whole hour talking about tricycle, which has been a part of my life for quite a long time. And I want to thank you for getting that incredible publication going. And everybody, we'll see you next week on Mindrolling. And this is the Be Here Now Network. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Raghu. Thank you.